Good morning, the world. This is a webcast from Brazil in relation to internal controls and Sarbanes-Oxley. I guess we leave this first page up because people who are joining us for the first time, they connect via video and then they don't hear anything, so they have to connect via audio as well. So we leave this, put this first slide up for a while. So I guess just to make people aware of that. So this is a 2-hour webcast. So we'll be on the webcast for the next 2 hours. It's the webcast is formal training for the purposes of those who have CRC in Brazil. It's also, we issue certificates for people who stay connected at least 1.5 hours out of the 2 hours. This webcast is recorded. It will be made available on the PwC Webcast. It's interactive, and we recommend that you ask a lot of questions. I'm going to go through here the agenda we have for today, the main themes, some important reminders, and the news. So we have with us today so we'll go through the introduction. We're going to do an initial survey. We have with us Marcus Paulo. Marcus, are you on the line?
Hi, Kieran. Yes, I am.
Okay, great. He's going to be presenting to us that some items of Sarbanes-Oxley and rules in relation to internal controls. We have also Ghislaine Sarol. Ghislaine, are you on the line?
I am, Kieran. Good morning, everybody.
Okay. Good morning, Ghislaine. And also Wes Kelly. Wes, are you on the line? Okay, I guess Wes will probably be joining us in a little bit. So and then at the end at 11 o'clock we're doing the test on for those who want a certificate for CRC purposes. We'll have a test at 11 o'clock. So the main themes we're going to discuss today: why are internal controls important? Who is responsible for evaluating internal controls? How deficiencies are evaluated? What happens when internal controls are ineffective? What are the most common issues with internal controls, and what changes may come for internal controls and evaluations? And I think Wes, are you with us now?
Yeah, I'm on.
Okay, that's great. So, and then, these are, I guess, the main themes we're going to be discussing today. These are just the rules for the purposes of anyone who wants a certificate. As we said, stay connected for 75% of the time. Our theme here is to keep calm and carry on with the pandemic and everything else that's going on. We have a lot of, I guess, everyone's is going through hard times. Some of the publications related to this, we have the Governance Insights Center, which there you have the link. We have Sarbanes-Oxley compliance publication, so we also have the link there in terms of talking about SOX and how to make SOX most efficient. Then we have a pathway to sustainability and enhancing SOX performance. One of the issues in terms of internal controls is we discuss a lot is how to make the internal controls most efficient and have the best quality of internal controls, most efficient internal controls possible. And then we have how to digitalize your SOX program. I guess in today's world, technology is becoming more important, and the impact of digitalizing controls is becoming more important. And then how to successfully manage a SOX compliance change management program. And then SOX, in terms of internal controls, applies to everything. And one of the areas that's most difficult is in terms of change management. Then rethinking your SOX program. Again, and then general data protection regulations. I guess this is something that's, at least here in Brazil, it's coming into play with local regulations about kick in that, and internal controls over financial reporting. And survey. Then we have internal controls over financial reporting and the causal update. And then the Sarbanes-Oxley 404 rules. So a lot of publications on this. I guess this theme's been around a long time, and those people. So we have a lot of publications on that, and I guess those were the principal ones that we identified. For those on the line as well, just to make you aware, next week we have our webcast on startups and IPOs and access to the capital markets. We have representatives of startups, investors in startups. For those of you interested, our next webcast in English is going to be on December the 16th. It's going to be 11 a.m. to 1 p.m. Brazilian time. And we're going to have Glenn, Gary, Cristiano, and myself on that. And I guess with that, we'll start here with the survey. So survey should appear on your screen, and then you've got 1 minute to reply. Okay, so the first one is, how do you believe internal controls generate value for your company? The significant potential losses that incur without internal controls. It's better governance, better operational efficiency, elimination of unnecessary costs, elimination of bureaucracy. So I guess here the question is, how do you believe internal controls generates value for your company? Which one of these is to consider most important in terms of the value that SOX generates? And I guess we're just coming to the end of the time here. Okay, and I mean, this is one of the issues that we have here in terms of how you generate value with internal controls and how it helps the company. What are the principal items here as to how it helps the company? So we're just processing the result. We're just processing the polls here, and we should just receive the polling answers. So we have this significant potential. So the most popular one was the first one, which there's significant potential losses without internal controls, i.e. risk reduction. And this is, I guess, a common theme that those companies which have poor internal controls are much more subject to having losses for various reasons. So it's a cost reduction, better governance, better operational efficiency, and then we have very few people with elimination of necessary costs and very, very few elimination of bureaucracy. So it's more in terms of risk reduction. And the next question is, are there any additional risks based on companies operating in controlled environment during the pandemic? Have there been additional risks identified during the pandemic? And then like a change in the flow of information, a change in the approval process, i.e. using like electronic approval, change in people involved, change in the training procedures, change in cyber risks. And I guess the point here is, like, with most people working remotely, at least those people who work in offices, how has that impacted the control environment and during the pandemic? And then we have here the principal areas of flow of information, of approval process, and So I think we just finished that the time up, so that we're processing that. So that these webcasts, they're open to everybody around the world. We've, I think, on this webcast, we have people from a number of countries around the world, and they're completely free, and they also serve as valid training. We issue certificates to whoever stays 75% of the time with us. So here we have impact of the pandemic. Most popular one is change in the approval process, i.e. DocSign. So the approval process has changed, and the change in flow of information is the next one. With very few changing people involved, change in the training, change in cyber risks as well is when we have a lot of hits on. So change in the flow of information, change in the approval process, and change in cyber risks are the, I guess, principal items that we have here. And next one, how internal controls of your company altered during the pandemic. So the first question was if we had changes in the process or in the risks, and it looks like we did. And then the next question is, well, have your internal controls changed during the pandemic? Either is a reduction in internal controls, no significant change except cybersecurity, or there's an increase in internal controls. And the idea here is, at the end of the day, is there been a revaluation of the controls environment and alteration in order to consider the changes that we just mentioned in the prior survey, or like those alterations weren't that significant to the company, or even a reduction to simplify the process. And I guess companies have been through a lot of change management with people working from home, and thus the process as to how things work in companies changed, and thus and now I guess what impact has that had on the controls environment, and has there been a significant change in the controls environment? And so what we have here is no significant change except cybersecurity is the most popular, but followed close behind by no significant change. So I guess despite the change in the process, other than cybersecurity, it looks like the majority of things hasn't been much change in the controls environment. Does your company make significant use of Excel spreadsheets, internal controls over financial reporting? Excel spreadsheets is one of the areas whereby if it requires a lot of work to get good controls, and it's one of the areas that generates a lot of challenges for internal controls. So the question here is, in the companies that you work in, is there still a significant use of Excel spreadsheets? And obviously, I guess with that comes a lot of challenges in terms of how you implement controls over that. Obviously, it's possible, just requires a lot of work, and normally companies create macros and then protect those macros via a number of items and a number of tools within Excel. And so let's see how relevant Excel is in relation to the controls of the companies. In the past, I guess, remember initially when Starbucks was being implemented, it would generate a lot of issues. Wow. So it's significant. So Excel continues to be significant within the environment of the within the environment of these companies, and that, I guess, is a challenge for internal controls. I guess we'll come on to that later, but it's interesting. It's still a significant use of Excel spreadsheets. Question 5: do you consider the implementation of internal controls over financial reporting, such as COSO and external audit, of internal controls over financial reporting generates value. Significant generation of value, not significant. Costs are greater than benefits. It's not possible to determine. So how do you, I guess, what do you think about evaluate the impact of SOX? I mean, SOX has been running for quite some time now, and those companies that have it, and how do you consider the cost benefit analysis of SOX? Is it significant generation of value, not significant, costs are greater than benefits, it's not possible to determine? And I guess this has been, I guess, since SOX was created, I guess it's been one of the big, I guess, discussion points as to the value that it creates and how to create value with a good internal controls environment. And I guess on the other side of that discussion, well, can you really measure the potential loss that you would have if you didn't have it? And as we saw in the previous question, that was one of the items that that was the big concern. If you didn't have SOX, that the potential loss you'd have. So we have here significant generation of value is the most popular one. So it's considered that internal controls over financial reporting, having a good SOX environment generates a significant generation of value, which is a good sign that that it generates value for companies. And number 6, if internal controls over financial reporting testing was voluntary, do you think your company, what do you think what sort of decision would you make? Would your internal control over financial reporting process would be maintained? Internal control over financial reporting process would remain, but there'd be no external testing. Internal control of financial reporting would be simplified, less documentation, cost-benefit analysis would be performed. So if you didn't have to maintain SOX, would you still maintain the internal controls and the external testing, the external audit of it, or not? Or would you just have the internal process but no external testing? Or would you simplify the internal controls process, or just do a cost-benefit analysis of the whole thing? So I guess if it wasn't a requirement, then how would you treat it? And I guess we just so for I guess for those companies that do apply it, so the most popular one here was we do a cost-benefit analysis of it, and then others, the second most popular point was it would remain, but there would be no external audit testing of the environment, of the internal controls environment. So I guess that's interesting, although it's considered to be important. Then I guess companies, if they weren't required to do it, they would reevaluate the way that they do it and the controls. And I guess currently, I guess the issue is that if each company were left to its own devices, that you create a different format of doing it. I guess which may not be consistent among the companies, and they're determining the standard for which to do that. So I guess now we have Marcus Paulo to tell us a bit about about SOX and internal controls. So Marcus, it's over to you.
Thank you, Kieran. I'd like to thank you very much for this opportunity to talk some minutes about this relevant topic, which is ICFR, especially in such challenging times. And I also thank you, all of you that joined this webinar. I truly hope that you find it useful. Well, I'm conscious that we will have today our VIP guests here, Elaine and Wes. But I was asked to spend just a few minutes providing or perhaps recapping some fundamental concepts around ICFR. So we'll be in a better position to understand the current hot topics regarding this SOX environment we have nowadays. Well, first of all, as you know, management is responsible to prepare their financial statements in accordance with the applicable financial reporting framework, for example, US GAAP or IFRS. And in fact, this responsibility goes much further than this, as you may realize when reading a 2NF report, which covers not only the financial statements, but several other information too. Another thing to keep in mind is that financial statements are not only comprised by items within the balance sheet or income statement, for instance, but it also includes the related notes that intend to provide further necessary information for stakeholders to fully understand the financials. So although there are some certain figures included in the financials that are very easy to understand, others may have a higher degree of complexity in their measurements. For instance, some complex accounting estimates. And for them, the related notes are even more important. So normally in that situation, the applicable GAAP, let's say IFRS, will determine not only how to record or present a number in the financial statements, but also what is required in terms of disclosure in the related notes. And this is also comprised by the whole set of the financial statements. And then under the section 404 of Sarbanes-Oxley Act, or as you call SOX, we also have the ICFR, as Kieran was discussing and making the survey with you guys. And it's important to remember that ICFR is not any type of internal controls, but the FR means the controls that are relevant to the preparation of the financial reporting. So those are the ones that are covered in this responsibility, right? And in this environment, then we have the independent auditor being part of all this structure, and the auditor, as everybody knows, reports on the financial statements. But in this situation here, the opinion of the auditor also covers the ICFR. So that's why we call an integrated audit, right? An audit that integrates an opinion of the financial statements, but also on the internal controls over financial reporting. That's interesting because you may have an unmodified opinion in the financial statements. That means the financial statements are material correct, but perhaps on the same entity, you can have some important deficiencies on the internal control. So that's why it's the same opinion, but it's a different opinion. You may have a different situation. I believe...
Just on that, Mark, it's interesting. We're looking at the Brazilian FPIs, and I guess of the and more or less a third of them reported material weaknesses for 2019. So I guess a significant amount of the companies reported significant material weaknesses, and and obviously that's obviously in all of those cases the opinion over the financial statements was a clean opinion, but they had issues with their internal controls environment.
Yeah, that may happen. The opposite would be more weird, right, Kieran? Because if you have a problem in your financial, probably, not always, but probably you have some failures in your internal controls, right? But yeah, that can happen. Very nice. Then Kieran was surveying about strong control environments, if you believe that this is important or not. But I brought some dimensions that we can consider when talking about a strong control environment and why this is really needed. First of all, the financial report, of course. With a more robust internal control environment, you can have a more precise or more accurate financial reporting, and this provides more credibility to any stakeholder you can designate, like even the owners of the company or the employees or the customers, well, anybody that's interested on the financials, right? But not only for that. Go ahead.
Yeah. I guess this is one of the things that investors, whenever they invest via the US, they know that they're investing in an environment that requires this internal controls over financial reporting framework. And although there's a cost associated with this that the companies are subject to, all of the investors know that I guess that exists, and I guess they get additional security from that, and of being in that environment. And I guess as well as the U.S. regulatory environment in general, the SOX is, if you like, a plus in terms of giving comfort to the investor.
Yeah, that's correct, Kieran. You mentioned about the regulatory that has a huge impact of, and there is also this layer, operational ones, right? Because when you have a very well-defined structure of internal controls, you know the roles, you can have a proper segregation of duties, for instance. So even in the operational side, I think a robust control environment can be very helpful as well, right? Okay, this is just to provide an overview of what could be an ICFR assessment process. It's as we call the top-down approach, right? Starting with doing the PMO of this process, the program management, but also going through the scoping. Not everything is relevant. You have to scope which business processes are really relevant in your financials. Then you can understand and see whether they are. Where are the risks? We commonly nominated as LSPMs, likely source of potential misstatements in each business process, right? And when you understand the process and you identify those LSPMs, then you are in a better position to perform your assessment, which in the ICFR environment covers, I think, two dimensions. One is the design effectiveness, right? It's very well designed. Each relevant process, for instance, if the process has a proper segregation of duties, as I mentioned, right? And the other one is for the internal controls of each business process that are considered relevant because they really address each LSPM, each likely source of potential statements, that this control would be a key control, and the operating effectiveness of those controls should also be tested. So this is what's happening here in controls testing and operating effectiveness. And at the end of the cycle, which is really not at the end, but throughout all the periods, right? If control deficiencies are identified, then the framework requires management and the auditors to evaluate those deficiencies, not only on an individual basis, but also on aggregating basis as well. And there comes some troubles, right? Some challenges in this process. So it's not really auditors like numbers, like counts, so we feel more comfortable on that. But having to evaluate control deficiencies is a kind of activity that requires a lot of judgment from auditors and from management itself, and because there are a lot of qualitative factors to consider, right?
Yeah, and I guess one of the big issues here in terms of evaluating controls is trying to understand the root cause, what initially generated that control failure, and on that basis, sometimes you have, I guess, sometimes a number of times we've been discussing like small monetary errors, and then discussing whether the root cause, because the root cause is much broader, that it could have caused much greater errors. So it's quite a difficult process to evaluate the potential impact of deficiencies.
Yeah, exactly. That's the qualitative factor that I'm referring to. But what we call the could factor, right? What could go wrong based on those deficiencies? And that's a tough exercise to perform sometimes. Yeah. Especially and it's tough when you have to evaluate control by control, and when you have to aggregate as well. This can create an even more challenging exercise, right? Yeah. And as you all know, these three categories would be the possible outcome from this evaluation. You can have a control deficiency, would be the lower level of a deficiency, right? Those control deficiencies, when we consider the root cause, as Kieran was saying, the could factor, the likelihood of potential misstatements due to the failure in the control or deficiency. Then, based on this analysis, you can have a control deficiency, a smaller, is a less risk deficiency, right? And those deficiencies are reported to management. But then, if you have a deficiency that is is more important, and if, for instance, governance should be, if we believe that the deficiency merits attention to the governance of the entity, then it's a significant deficiency. And if the rigor is so high of certain deficiencies or a combination of deficiencies, then it causes a material weakness, which is the result of having at least one material weakness is that the opinion on the internal controls is a negative opinion, right? You are saying that the controls, the ICFR is not robust sufficient to prevent or detect material misstatement on that financials, which is the worst case scenario in terms of ICFR.
Yeah. And I saw you mentioned here the CVM, the local CVM requirements. I guess that's been one of the issues that we've had here in terms of the local companies are required to report to the public the internal control, I guess, the internal control issues that they have, and most companies understand that to be the significant deficiencies that they have. And obviously here you mentioned that the consistency between what's reported for SOX purposes and what's reported for CVM purposes. I guess the other issue is whether, I guess a lot of times especially companies doing IPOs, reporting internal controls, it's seen often as protecting the company for potential issues that could be identified in the future, and it's not something. So you see a lot of companies, I think, in the I say over, like, I think there's a recent study showed like 50% of a lot of companies having material weaknesses in the US, but it's not something you see with the, I guess, in the local environment. Yeah, I think you just about discussed that, but it's interesting that it's not something you see companies doing IPOs in Brazil reporting, and it's interesting that in the US it's often considered as a form of protecting the company, of disclosing potential issues that they have as they're turning public.
Yeah, exactly, Kieran. That was my intention when I brought this picture here, or this graphic, because as you mentioned, the CVM in Brazil always compare what's being reported in terms of internal control deficiencies, and sometimes some entities are reporting as having known control deficiencies, but that when they pick the internal controls letter from the internal auditor is a different story, right? And that's a different position, as you mentioned, about the others in the U.S. market that's going public for the first time. The number of the ones that are starting this process reporting material weakness is half of them, as you can see here, and you mentioned here. That's a different position, right? Which I believe sometimes is better, because if you go to an IPO saying that you have no control deficiencies, and 6 months later or 1 year later, you come up with some material weakness, I think it's an even worse scenario, right?
Yeah, and especially if companies, if companies at the time they do their IPO that they don't report any control issues, and then subsequently that they have some issue with their financial reporting, and there was no communication or that they had control issues, or that they could have this sort of issue, the companies could be subject to being sued by investors who could feel that they should have been informed about these issues at the date of the initial IPO.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think the only thing I'd like to add here is that when a company is starting the IPO process, even though the auditor has not performed an integrated audit, the auditor does an evaluation of internal controls, at least an understanding of that. And even in the opinion of the financial, which is not an opinion on ICFR, if the auditor already knows some control deficiencies, the auditor is required to make the assessment and even come up with material weakness that were identified on a single financial statement audit, right?
Yeah, I guess, and this is an issue that often, I guess, companies going to the US for the first time is often a cause of stress of discussing, discussing these issues, and I guess, but it's interesting that normally, that it's not, I guess, such a great surprise to investors that private companies that are becoming public for the first time would have such issues. And, I don't believe that it's such a relevant issue in terms of the price of the IPO, as long as the company discloses this at the start. I think it becomes a much bigger issue if they have such issues and don't disclose them as to what could happen subsequently.
Hey, Kieran and Marco, this is Wes Kelly. I just kind of wanted to add on to that point. I do think your messaging's right. I do think a lot of underwriters and investors expect to see it in the IPO phase. I think the questions that people, a couple of things that we've noticed is, I think investors feel like when material weaknesses are disclosed in the IPO phase, and over time they see management making remedial actions to remedy those, it reinforces the importance that management's placing on not just controls but financial reporting as a whole. And then the other thing that I would add is, when you have these material weaknesses that evolve a couple years after you go public, it's only natural for everybody to ask the question, how long have these been out here? Why did it just come to everybody's attention 2 or 3 years? Was it a certain transaction? And many times with these material weaknesses, sometimes it goes back that it really was an issue that has been going on for a number of years from that standpoint. And regulators are really interested in that from that standpoint. So those are the two points I just wanted to add on that real quick.
That's very interesting, Wes. Thank you very much. I remember a situation I had in the past, kind of similar to what you mentioned about having a deficiency being reported year by year. It was not a material weakness, that's one, but it was a significant deficiency. But I remember the regulator challenging us, saying, well, if you have a significant deficiency reported like 4 or 5 years in a row, isn't that time already to call this a material weakness? It was an interesting discussion. Kieran, I'm not sure if you want to add something.
Yeah. The other interesting thing is that even the companies that are listing locally, even those, almost all the companies doing local IPOs, and in Brazil at the minute we have the largest list of companies doing IPOs that we've ever had in the history of Brazil. But almost all of those companies are also issuing, selling their shares in the US via 144A. And normally in the discussions that we have for the purpose of the content of those documents, especially for the offering document to foreign investors, the reference is the US market. And this is what you expect in the US market, and this is a significant discussion in that respect. But in terms of the internal controls issues, I mean, it's something that maybe I guess is that you don't see management that concerned about. But at the end of the day, they're selling shares into the same market, and that reference exists, and it's something that they need to be careful for. And we see more and more of these cases of companies being questioned in terms of their disclosures, even though they're doing private, they're doing 144A offerings into the US. So I think something we talked about on one of the previous webcasts. So I don't doubt that this is going to become an increasingly important issue, even for the companies listed locally that have offerings abroad.
And Kieran, it's Kieran. If I may just add there, based on my experience, and it's not specific to Brazil, but it's specific to all the market activity we have seen in the U.S. And as you mentioned, we discussed in previous webcasts, right, what is an FBI, the international offerings, and we pointed out that there's been a lot of more activity in the U.S. market with smaller companies and earlier on in the stage of the life of companies. So one misunderstanding very often when companies come to the U.S. market for IPO, they look at that they don't have to report on management controls like you mentioned before. And I think it's very important to not forget that not having to report under management controls doesn't mean you don't have to have a control. And if you know there is a material weakness, in the company that needs to be reported, back to the point there. And I think when you mentioned there is a big increase, I think it's in my mind, based on my experience, again, it's really a combination of two things: more IPOs from different types of companies, to better acceptance from everybody that, it's earlier on, disclosing early a material weakness is better for all the points we just mentioned here, and that understanding that you need strong control even if you don't report on ICSR. So it's not uncommon, just to give a little bit light and examples of what we are going to see to make it concrete and practical for a participant here, is that the next question I get is, okay, we have a material weakness, but what is it? What is the source? And where do we disclose? Because we don't have to do management report or auditor's report on it. So the idea there is in an F1, which is the offering for an IPO, you will have a risk factor indicating the material weakness, and very likely as well potentially in the MD&A, where it's going to highlight what is the material weakness, more than one. And very often you will see something around, segregation of duties, technical skills to, special technical skills from financial reporting and year-end process closing, because it definitely requires a lot more timely and consistent closing of financial information. You have less time, you need to report more frequently, and in like a very specific rules and for the U.S. market. So they are kind of the common, I just wanted to share there that we see. And I think it's, to your point, I just want to say, at least now in the U.S., it's almost expected that there is one or two in the IPO process, and it's been rare in my experience these days that it goes without one. It depends against the company. If the company has been listed, reporting, having big controls in the past, so it's the facts and circumstances. But just wanted to highlight that as well.
Yeah. I'm just wondering, is that because we're seeing a lot of companies, I guess in the technology, with some sort of technological solution, and could this be part of the issue as well, that the greater dependence of these companies on technology also increases the risk of issues and of material weakness? Because I guess the more complex the system, the more issues that you have in terms of having an adequate control environment.
Yeah, I was about to say that, Kieran. I was listening to Ghislaine, and we are saying that, okay, it's okay to go to an IPO and have some problems in your controls, and you can use this experience to show your commitment to get this fixed. But depending on the type of the features, like Ghislaine was talking about, segregation of duties issues, or even IT general controls, as you are mentioning, for an entity that's highly relies on IT systems. So those are the ones that are not easy to fix in 1 week or two. So this commitment should be taken very seriously, right? Because it's a tough exercise sometimes. Depends on the nature of the maturity of your controls, right?
Yeah.
And just to finish this part here, and we are saying that this is a very, very challenging exercise, but this year this challenge is even higher because of the impact of COVID-19. So I know that Kieran already included some questions here, and you based on the responses, you are considering already some impacts. For instance, I think the biggest response here, the most popular one, was the increased risk of cybersecurity. I'm glad that people are aware of that, because in this situation where we are changing some controls, we are having some controls operated on a remotely basis, different than in the past. So that increases the risk of cybersecurity, of course, or even the fraud risk, because if the controls are getting more fragile, then there's a higher risk of someone bypassing those controls and committing fraud. So it's expected to have some changes in the internal controls, and even in IT risks and relevant ITGCs as well, the IT general controls. So depends on those impacts and changes. There could be a higher fraud risk or even a higher fragility to cybersecurity attacks. And I also brought some a last item here to everybody take into consideration, which is the use of service organizations, because we are talking about our internal control environment. But it's very common for a lot of entities nowadays to use service organizations. And if those service organizations are relevant to your financials, then you should be aware of the impact on their control as well, right? So this is something to keep in mind as well. And I think that was the last one I had, Kiran.
That's great. Thanks very much, Marcus and Marcus Paulo. So so I guess let's get into some questions for Ghislaine and Wes. So I guess Ghislaine, Wes, maybe first of all, can you tell us a little bit about your experience in this area?
Sure. So as I'm part of the national office, as I think if you joined prior Webcast, and I'm part of the SEC services group, which I'm focusing especially on foreign private issuers reporting under IFRS. And so I'm involved with a lot of companies out of Europe, Brazil, and a couple of other territories here. My experience is in the context of those filings that we talked about, whether it's transactions offering access to the U.S. market, or it's the ongoing reporting requirements as you have from an annual perspective with Form 20F. Most of the challenges are usually we've seen is in the context of the transaction, but as well in the reporting framework, depending on all the new transaction environments that we have seen. So like you said, cybersecurity has been one, working remotely has been bringing some challenge, and it looks like every year there's a new challenge that came up. So in my experience, I had a lot of discussion on ICFR and what's the impact, and we can discuss that definitely further a little bit later on the filings, the access to the market, the transaction if we do one, whether you're reporting an ongoing reporter or not. So I think that's pretty much a quick summary here. And I turn to Wes.
Thanks, Ghislaine. Real quickly, I'm Wes Kelly. I'm a partner in the U.S. firms ASM&T, Auditing Services, Methodologies, and Tools. I spend a good bit of my time, as the slide indicates here, dealing with consultations with engagement teams. One area that is a topic of frequent consultation is ICFR from that standpoint. So I spend a lot of time with existing public companies, but also right now a lot of time with companies that are getting ready to go through that IPO stage, going public, being acquired through a special purpose acquisition company, SPACs, what we call them here in the U.S., a lot of that activity going on. So I do spend a good bit of my time from an ICFR perspective, dealing with teams in the U.S., but also Ghislaine has graciously pulled me along a few times on consultations with some FPIs and various network firms around the globe to help them think through from a controls perspective. I've been in the group. This is my second time in ASM&T. I've been there for about 4 years now. Prior to my time in ASM&T, I spent 2 years at the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, where I was in the Office of the Chief Accountant, where I dealt with oversight of the PCAOB as part of my group, monitoring PCAOB standard setting, but also as part of the Office of Chief Accountant, I was brought in various situations related to control matters. Probably the easiest way is there is a comment letter issued by the Division of Corporate Finance to a registrar and issuer. There's a question around it. They get an answer back. And those kind of questions sometimes really focus on controls, understanding controls. You know, if there was a restatement, a revision, what are the control implications? How did management think about the control implications of that? Considerations around material weaknesses and stuff like that. So That's kind of my experience from, I'll say, from an ICFR perspective. Of course, like many others, I was in the practice. So I've been in the practice and dealt with public companies since actually Sarbanes-Oxley became effective back in 2004 in the U.S. So I guess I'm now on 15 years of dealing with ICFR from that standpoint.
Great. And I guess we just got a comment here from Leandro Argito, who's asking that usually management's reluctant to disclose control deficiencies as material weaknesses in IPOs, but it seems, however, that being fully transparent would actually protect the entity, enabling it to address the issue and show the developments in this, and that would be a better strategy for companies rather than, I guess, being negative. I guess would you have any comment on that in terms of your experience, in terms of reluctance of management to disclose that sort of issue?
I would just say, from my perspective, I think a lot of times management has to step back and they think about many times, just if you think about it, at least in the U.S., right, when you go to the public company reporting framework, you may have gone from a situation where you have to report your financial results once a year. Maybe you're reporting it within 120 days of year end to a financial institution or somebody that's using your financials, limited distribution of your financial statements. When you turn into the public space, right, now you're in the U.S., you're on a quarterly reporting framework that you have to do things on a quarterly basis. You also, at the same time, have to also think about on the quarters as well as year end. Now I have a compressed deadline for all my closeout of procedures to take place from that standpoint. And as you can imagine, as the companies are building up size, they are starting to incur, I'll say, more complex accounting issues that they're having to deal with and think through. How do you record these types of transactions and stuff like that? And so a lot of times it kind of becomes management kind of starts to see it. When you think about, IPOs, a lot of the material weaknesses focus around the people. Do you have enough people to be a public company? Do you have enough people to make these compressed timelines, somebody to evaluate the accounting? How does the financial statements come together now? And doing that on a periodic basis, it becomes kind of self-evident to management teams that they're like, hey, I need more people. I've got to spend more time thinking about my policies and procedures that I need to put in place. Right, how do I account for income taxes now? Or, okay, now I've got a lot more transactions. I've got IT that I've got to think about. How do I make sure there's segregation of duties and restricted access within the IT function? So I think over time, management starts seeing things, and they also start finding, okay, we're going through things, we're finding. Another common area we see is adjustments are identified by management or the auditor, and that's okay. Most of these adjustments are a result of there must have been some kind of lapse, or there must be an issue within our controls and our processes why we didn't identify that timely, right, from that standpoint. So I think a little bit of it becomes self-evident over time, and then I just think a little bit of it has become over time. I think a lot of the underwriters that are going through these and counsel, even the management teams, are asking them, do we have any control issues? Are you sure we don't have any control issues? And I think management, they think back and they reflect on everything that's happened, and then they look at what they're going to have to deal with going forward. I think they many times come to that conclusion on their own that, hey, I need to take time here. I do have some design gaps or deficiencies within my controls that I need to get on a path to correction from that standpoint.
Yeah, and maybe, Karen, it's good. I just, I totally agree with what Wes was just saying there, and I just want to be optimistic. It doesn't mean that it's all bad and it's always an issue, right? The control. I think we are trying just to say that as you're entering a different market, and I think the point that Wes was just making, that you used to report to like a private, maybe a bank. Now you're exposed to very sophisticated investors and non-sophisticated investors, but it's public. So it's a very different environment. And I think the point here that we're making is you need very high quality reporting standard. And the best way to approach and get high reporting quality is to have the strong controls that go with it. So I think that's kind of the message there that I want to portray, is that don't see just the control on one side, just don't see the financial statement on one side. It's an entire process, and it's an entire filing that you go, and you have to assess in which environment you are giving that out, right? In which as we know, the U.S. market is definitely quite demanding. I want to mention as well, like we were talking about, more compressed time, more frequent reporting. As a foreign private issuer, which I think we have mostly here in our audience, technically you have to report on ICFR if you're subject to once a year at year-end, which are slightly different than domestic issuers. So there's some accommodation as well for foreign private issuers, just so you know, so better access. There is some accommodation to enter the system that you don't have to do Rule 404 either, like we mentioned. So there's definitely some accommodation that you don't have to do a full 404 right there when you IPO or like on a quarter basis. You don't have to, as a foreign private issuer, to report on a quarter basis, except if you do transactions where you would need some quarters, and controls are not due on a quarter basis. However, more and more around the world, the foreign private issuers are doing quarter reporting because investors want more current and timely information to the market. And nothing better than having a strong control environment to be able to produce those and be able to go with a transaction following that.
Yeah. We got a question here from Paulo Arakaki asking about the difference between JSOX, Japanese SOX, SOX and Sarbanes-Oxley. I guess in my experience, the U.S. environment and the use of COSO is much more sophisticated and regulated, I guess, compared to Japanese SOX. I don't know if you have any experience with that, Killian or Wes, but like I guess my experience is been that the U.S. SOX concept is much more, I guess, detailed and I guess much more sophisticated than the JSOX. But I mean, I guess now that's not the focus here. I guess moving on here, and then maybe Wes, do you consider that the internal controls to be important for a company?
Yeah, and just real quick on that, Kieran. I do not have any experience with JSOX, so I'd have to talk to somebody that does have that experience. So I didn't want to. I just wanted to close the loop on that real quick. So I'm not. I wouldn't disagree with your opinion, but I don't really have an opinion from that standpoint. So, but on the importance of controls, yeah, I do think controls are really important, and I really think it goes back to at the end. At the beginning, to really focus on providing high quality financial information to the users of the financial statements. And I think internal controls play a really, really important part on how you get from the transactions that the company's doing, how that ultimately finds its way into the financial statements and the financial reporting of the company. So I think internal controls are important because they're I'll call it the checks and balances that management has in place over the key process and procedures to ultimately record the financial information. Just a couple things, the SEC definitely has the same viewpoint around this. They have guidance to management that was issued back in 2007 that deals with internal controls over financial reporting. And the SEC is clear about the responsibilities of management around this and really what the purpose of this is. And I think it ties into what I said earlier, is that management's responsible for maintaining a system of internal control over financial reporting that provides reasonable assurance regarding the reliability of financial reporting and the preparation of financial statements for external purposes in accordance with generally accepted accounting principles. So they're clear that it's important to have it. And the SEC beyond ICFR also has requirements around other controls, internal accounting controls that management has in place around how information is recorded in their financial statements and dealing with their regulatory compliance issues from that standpoint. So controls are important to the SEC. To me, as auditors, controls are important as well. Number one, we have a regulator as well. The PCAOB clearly has requirements and responsibilities to the auditors about auditing internal controls over financial reporting. But I just kind of think about how business is done now and continues to evolve. Businesses today run off a high volume of transactions, right? And when you think about, in order for those high volume transactions to be reported appropriately, completely, accurately, I think it's important to have a system of internal controls that governs and covers all that from that standpoint. So I think that's important, as well as you think about more automation being introduced into how business is done today, more technology being introduced from that standpoint. It's important to think about automated controls like you have in place to check, system checks of individual transactions, but then even bringing it a layer up from there with automation. What controls are in place around information technology, the general controls that we talk about, the restricted access, the access issues. So I really think it's important when you think about kind of the evolution of companies and how they're continuing to evolve. I really think it's important that you have a system of internal controls, both including, I'll call, manual elements that we deal with. You think about your normal like reconciliations, but also some automated controls and the automated controls that are in place to ultimately ensure that high quality financial information is being produced by the company that's provided to ultimately users of the financial statements.
That's great. And maybe Ghislaine, you could tell us a little bit about whether errors in the financial statements are always the result of a controls failure?
When we say always, it's never the answer, right? I think that's the way we answer the quiz usually. If it's always, it depends. Is always the answer, right? That being said, that's the trick, right, for answering questions mostly. But that being said, when there is an error, and if it's a material error to start, it's going to be a very hard presumption that there is as well a material weakness to start. And you have to demonstrate, I would say, that why with the material error, then it doesn't constitute a material weakness. If it is not a material error, but it's, let's say, something that it was, or even more than one error, it drove a revision, or maybe not even, or there's accumulated errors in there, but we covered before the revision, so meaning it's not a material error, but it's too big to be corrected, for example, in the period, so you revise your prior year's financials. You would have as well to look at the error framework and at the controls errors and whether that constitutes a material weakness. I have to say it's definitely not unusual, at least in my experience, to have as well with revision a material weakness. So you may have a revision, but you may have a material weakness there. Not all of them go one for one. I have seen material error without a material weakness. That's very, very rare. Very, very rare, right? So material errors is usually aligned with a material weakness in my experience, but again, not always. And a revision will be, as well something to consider for material weakness. The key there is that you always have to think about the could factor. I'm sure many of you have heard that. But this is very, very important in your assessment. And I always advise teams, clients, as they do errors and they do an assessment of the error, they usually do a good work of like starting to document the Sub 99 memo for a US environment, looking at the income statement, looking at some of the other criteria of Sub 99. Sometimes they forget, some of the other metrics that goes and are important for investors. So always very important. When there are errors, calculate the sum. Management and the engagement teams, the auditor have to look and prepare a Sub 99 memo, look at the impact on the key metrics, but as well, not forget to assess at that point in time the controls. Don't leave the control for year end or for later to be whether, it's a separate process. As I mentioned before, it's one big reporting. So it's addressing whether there's a material weakness and something to fix. As soon as there is an identification of the error, it is definitely the best practice at that point. And it's amazing how many times I see memos and Sub 99 that don't think about the control implication. and especially the could factor. So with the could factor, right, is the idea is, okay, we had a deficiency and we had an error, and the error was for a certain amount. Could that have been bigger if and what is the total balance there of that could have been exposed? And why is that then not just a matter of weakness or a bigger issue, and how do we fix it? So I think that's kind of in my experience there, Kieran.
Yeah, I guess, and the other one of the issues here is that a lot of the times these errors, be they small or big, that they're identified during the closing process, and the companies normally have very tight closing processes, and you mentioned the reporting requirement on a quarterly basis or an annual basis. When then, as we're getting here to year end, and some companies, in the year end, just before they're closing and doing the 20F, and they identify errors, this becomes I'm guessing a very stressful process, identifying errors and then having to do this evaluation of internal controls at the end, after all of the other tests of internal controls were done, and not knowing right until the last minute whether they have an issue to report or not. I guess, and Wes, maybe if you could tell us what are some of the other challenges for internal controls, like systems, non-recurring, complex transactions, changing personnel, review controls, and even in the environment that we're in, this pandemic environment.
Yeah, no, great question. So I think a couple of things, and I'll hit on some of the key buzzwords that you hit on there, Kieran, kind of to tee me off. Non-recurring and complex transactions. I mean, I think how we think about that is you need a framework in place, a system of controls to think about those items as they come up, right? And that you want to be proactive and have a framework to think through those non-recurring transactions. For example, as a business combination is coming on, look, you may not have all the details of how the business, what you're requiring and how that kind of works, and every business combination might be different. But I think you do need a framework for, okay, who's going to be responsible for making the initial, assessment of here are the assets acquired, the liabilities assumed. Are we going to need to bring in specialists to help us? Is there going to be evaluation involved? So I think I always tell management you need a process in place, and you don't need this kind of, I'll call it, haphazard ad hoc control that jumps up all the time you have these non-recurring transactions, right? I think there's definitely some customization that's really important as you think about the various transactions. But I think it's important that management's kind of proactive in thinking about, hey, these non-recurring transactions, how do we need to account for them? A lot of upfront thinking around what goes into ultimately recording those transactions. So I think that's important. Different systems. I think around different systems, I think the biggest thing that we run in there is access. Who has access to do things in different systems? Is it appropriately restricted? Do you have people that have the ability to create things, approve things on their own without any kind of additional oversight or review by management or another individual within management? So I think systems are really important. The one thing I'll hit on real quick, because Kieran, you put it at the end, but I think it's really important. What we've seen in the pandemic, especially in the U.S., I think most folks are aware the U.S. is still we are still very virtual, a lot of remote working arrangements. And I know that varies among different regions of our country, but also even throughout the globe, like where everybody is from that standpoint. I think our guidance out to management teams have been thinking about this, as well as audit teams, is number one, think about risk. Are there new risks introduced into your organization because of a remote working environment? Right? Are things done virtual now versus in person, how things were done in the past? And do you need to think about, I'll say, refining, updating your controls to make sure any existing or new risk are addressed from that standpoint? So we've seen a lot of that, where even down to the point of, okay, a reconciliation used to be signed off by people in the office and passed from office to office. In the current environment, there's a lot of, okay, you're reviewing it, then you're passing it along virtually, right? It's being emailed, it's being linked in the same document, people have access. And so where management teams have been thinking about is what is the evidence that I need to support my assessment of or evaluation of that key control, right? So that's a thing that I know management teams have been really focused on. Do our controls still work? What have we learned in the remote environment? Are there opportunities for us to continue to refine control? So I'd say that's what we're seeing in the current pandemic environment. Hitting on a couple other things you mentioned, complex transactions. Those types of transactions, you might need to use information from external sources outside your company. The company might need to engage their own experts or specialists to assist in developing. Think about accounting estimates from that standpoint. I think in these situations, what's really important is management needs to have controls in place. Management can't abdicate the responsibility for getting the information together to a specialist or to an external party that's providing them information. Management needs to have controls and processes in place to review that information as it's going through the process. Ultimately, many times that information influences or is ultimately an input to what is recorded in the financial statements of the company. So I think it's important that management has controls around that information that's coming either in those situations from external information sources, from specialists or experts as well. I think that's really important. Changes in personnel, like anything about any control, we always think about the business control or process owner. I think history would show us from time to time when there are changes in business process owners, we've seen instances where there's like a design gap. Somebody doesn't do the control for a number of months because somebody just left the organization. You're trying to get the assignment of roles and responsibilities from that standpoint. So that's the one thing we always look about. Or have there been any changes from a business process owner or business control owner's standpoint? But we also think about understanding when there is a change, has the level of review and what that business control owner is doing, has it really changed? Are they doing it to the same level that we may have been comfortable with the prior person, the person that previously did that? Have we seen a drop off in the level of review, the level of follow-up granularity in that review due to the change in personnel? So I think that's important to think about. And then that kind of dovetails a little bit into review controls. Review controls are typically, they're not your transactional level controls. They're kind of usually typically a step above that. Think about frequently you see those with business performance reviews, controls over complex areas, accounting estimates. And I think what's really important in those is sometimes demonstrating what the control owner is actually doing as part of that control. Is it, are they investigating when there are changes that are unexpected? What does that follow-up look like? Those types of things. And the challenges in the past that we've seen in that is the evidence that the auditor and management maintain around those controls. Is it clear that you understand? A common example we see in these meetings from time to time is it is a monthly meeting done by management at the organization to review the financial results of the different business units, or we'll say business units. Sometimes those meetings have already taken place before the auditor comes around, right? And so how do you can't recreate the meeting, so what is the evidence that management has about, okay, hey, here's part of the discussion that took place as we were reviewing those financial results. And we've seen teams and management teams as well as auditors kind of over time kind of think about these, and are there ways that maybe the auditor can observe the meeting? But we've also seen situations where management, for good reason, didn't necessarily want the auditor there for those meetings, right? They're not trying to hide anything, but they want to make sure at the end of the day they're having a robust internal discussion about these things. In those situations, what we've seen in certain instances is somebody at that meeting, maybe it's a key client contact or maybe even internal audit attends those meetings, and they take notes. And they give us that information, and it allows us to understand the discussion, the granularity and the debate that kind of went into the evaluation of the financial results. So that's just kind of one example, but I would say those are really some of the more challenging areas when I think about ICFR that we encounter on a routine basis. Ghislaine, I don't know if you had any other items that you thought might be helpful in this area.
Thanks, Wes. I think you covered it there very well. I think it's important to continue to assess on a recurring basis, embed that in the ongoing process, and then have a process along the year, like you said, with embedded in there. So I think thank you for that. I think nothing much more here at this point.
Yeah, well, we have a question here from Gustavo Modelli, who's asking about internal controls in a startup company. I guess, and like, what should a company, and I guess next week we're going to have a webcast on startups and how to get from a startup to an IPO. And I guess, would you have any considerations as to, what companies should be thinking of whenever they're starting out? And I guess a lot of these companies, they, I guess, plan to expand exponentially, and I guess I've seen issues of companies whereby they depend on a lot of technology to expand exponentially very quickly, and they don't set up the controls at the start, and then they get into very difficult discussions about reconciling accounts and reconciling numbers. I remember that even like back in like a long time ago, these internet companies set up, like they were growing extremely quickly, but they had all of these issues around their control environment. I don't know if you have any comments on that in terms of these companies that are just starting up now, and then they've got these plans to grow very quickly, and what they should be thinking about.
Yeah. Go ahead, Ghislaine.
Sorry.
No, you go.
I was just going to say, just from my experience, and then definitely I will leave to Wes like the more technical piece there. But I think for me, it's for those companies, as the entire process is, again, to focus on providing reliable and high-quality financial information to the market at some point, right? As part of that, early on, thinking about the entire thing, the timeline, including controls up front, right? And so for me, it's part of the planning we were talking about last time. Don't leave it to the last minute, and then have a right timeline of when you want to go public, when you're starting up, when you want, like, what level of development you want as a startup company. And I think the two keys, or the three few items that I see that are always trouble for like a startup is, one, because of limited resources at the beginning, and then it grows, is where do you invest your time and where do you invest your cost, right? And for the segregation of duties seems to be always a recurring issue, right? Because you have you don't have that many people, and it's very hard, and a lot of the same people do everything. So thinking about how you can, as you develop, making sure that you have good controls and segregation, whatever it is that you can put in place, is one first thing. The second item, in my mind, that I see is definitely very challenging in those cases is, again, because I admire people that are starting up and doing the company. It's a lot on the plate, right? You have to know about financial reporting. You have to know about the US environment. You have to talk to investors. You have to talk to banks, etc. So having the right advisors and having the technical skill set to be able to prepare your financial information is as well key. So we see a lot of issues just because there's not the enough knowledge in those reporting and accounting standpoints. So then think about early on having an advisor to help at that point, and then you can grow it internally if as needed. But it's easier to plan it before than fixing errors in the future or issues in the future, in my mind. So there will be the two or three things in my mind that are usually as you start up that I will recommend to build up. And Wes, I know you wanted maybe say something different than me.
No, Ghislaine, you did a great job. I analogize it to I'll analogize to kids and homework, right? My kid's got a paper due at the end of the week, and it's a 5-page paper, and he comes in on Monday and says, wow, I got to do this paper by Friday. That's a lot of work. And it's, well, why don't you divide it up and you kind of work through it in chunks. As you grow, you build things, you do things. And I think that's right, Ghislaine, how you're thinking about it. Those are the common issues. And the companies that are, thinking ahead of those, doing it one stage at a time, trying to get myself prepared for this stage. All right, I'm going to build the controls around this. Okay, I'm getting bigger. I need to expand my controls. It's much better to be in that model versus, okay, I'm not going to worry about controls. until or people until I get to right at the finish line. It's just a lot to catch up with in a short period of time. And I do think your example about trusted business advisors, I think, is really important. Right. And I tell people all the time, there's nothing wrong with, raising your hand and saying, hey, I need somebody to help me with some of maybe it's even a complex transaction when you're in your early startup days, getting a business advisor to help you work through it. As long as you have controls in place around what they're doing, I think it really makes a lot of sense to do those things. So I think you're right on, and the issues that you were mentioning, I think they're spot on with what I've seen as well.
Okay. And Gary, could you tell us something about the SEC rules in relation to internal controls?
Sure. So I will focus here on foreign private issuers. But two things. One is it's always important first are you a foreign private issuers or domestic? Because as I mentioned, foreign private issuers have slightly different reporting requirements on ICFR, including auditors' reports, which is usually if you're a filer, it's once a year. At the end of the year, if you are a large accelerated filer and you're required to have both the management's report and control and the auditor's report and control. Again, if you do an IPO, you're not required to do 404 during that first filing. However, if there is some issues that are identified, you're always required that it's material information to be disclosing it in an SEC filing. The second point, so knowing whether you're domestic or an SBI is very important because domestic will have to report on for foreign controls on a quarter basis. The second item that is very important as you look at the requirement from an SEC standpoint is what is your status? Are you a large accelerated filer, a non-accelerated filer? Are you an EGC? Are you a newly public company like I just mentioned? Are you a non-accelerated filer? And depending on your status, which is determined, all of those are determined at June 30th, so 6 months before calendar year entity, will determine whether you have to do management reports and control, and if you need to have as well the auditor's report on the control assessment. It's very important to watch that from a company and auditor's perspective, because as you have time to prepare in a way, or are you going to lose your EGC status? Because more than one company got surprised with the market value, and as you know, with this environment, it's been very surprising. Some company got a very high market value because in certain business, some dropped completely. So looking at your status as of June 30 is a very good thing to see in which bucket you are looking at and what are your requirements for this coming year end. So that's what I wanted to mention. And then the other piece that I wanted to mention is that I want to make sure it's clear here is it's not because you have a material weakness or you don't, or you have a significant deficiency that I know some reports you have in Brazil, that you can't issue a Form 20F or an F1. I think we made it clear along the way here, but I just want to make sure that it's clear. It's not like a qualification in a report. It's not like an except for that would not be acceptable, like a scope limitation or something like that. It's different. It's a control deficiency that is reported. So a company can still issue 20F, can still do a lot of things in there. It doesn't impact that part here. So hopefully that answers your question, Kieran.
Yeah, it's great. And I guess next one for Wes, what are the typical types of internal control failures which you reported, and what is required if internal controls are evaluated not to be effective?
Yeah, and so Kieran, I'll hit real quickly. The IPOs, I think we've hit on it. Resources, process controls in place, for lack of policies, procedures, controls in place. That can include policies related to period end financial reporting, segregation of duties, and information technology general controls. I think we discussed those at length. The others I'll mention is that we commonly see, and I'll call these with companies that have been public for a number of years, many times deal with areas such as revenue recognition, We saw several of those with the change in the model for U.S. GAAP. So we see that it's another area that's a lot of high volume small dollar transactions. So issues that when controls have issues can have huge impacts to companies from that standpoint. So we see things around, I would say, revenue transactions, income taxes, still an area of frequent material weaknesses and control issues that we deal with. Within the actual financial statements, we still, in the U.S., we see a lot of issues around the statement of cash flows. People, certain transactions, somehow in the preparation of the cash flow, something gets left out. They forget to account for it. Sometimes I've had them where the signs are in the wrong direction when they were doing the cash flow worksheet to pull the cash flow information together. So we still see stuff around that. And then the other area that I would hit on from time to time that we do see is, I'll call it areas of estimates, accounting estimates, whether it be a valuation issue, sometimes within a goodwill impairment assessment. Had those where even the allocation of the carrying value to the reporting units, there was an error in that calculation which shielded an impairment that ultimately was a material number from that standpoint. So seeing those, then also from time to time, just even the recording of a business combination, a lot of fair value associated with that from that standpoint. So those are kind of the frequent areas that we see internal control failures reported. Yes. Kieran, you want me to keep going on that one a little bit about, what are the, the steps if controls are not evaluated to be effective?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, so I think a couple things. We've talked about this already about kind of management's responsibility, right, to report the material weakness and evaluate the impact on disclosure controls and procedures, right? So material weakness in internal controls over financial reporting, which rolls up as part of disclosures, controls, and procedures from that standpoint. Typically, what we also see is management start in their disclosures discussing plans for remediation. It's not a requirement that you have it in there, but many times management, along with their legal counsel, says, hey, we need to start making some comments about remediation. Even, some of these that break late in the game, there hasn't been a whole lot of time to think about the timeline for remediation, but putting on paper kind of, as part of the root cause that management goes through to really understand what was the ultimate root cause of the material weakness. It allows them to think through, hey, here's some of the activities, the actions that I may take in the future to remediate the material weakness from that standpoint. And the other thing I would just say from an audit standpoint, clearly if the auditor is reporting on internal controls over financial reporting, the disclosure of the material weakness takes place in the auditor's report. That typically mirrors the language that's in the item 15 from that standpoint as far as the material weaknesses that have been identified from that standpoint. The other thing that I would just say really quickly is there are situations where the auditor may not necessarily have to report on internal controls over financial reporting. We typically, I think Delane laid an example out. We see this with smaller companies. There's not a requirement for the auditor to issue an audit report on internal controls over financial reporting. In those situations, as we tell our audit teams, management still has that responsibility. They still have to evaluate internal controls over financial reporting. They can't not do that from that standpoint. In those situations where we're not issuing a report, but management has to issue a report on ICFR, we think it's important for the auditor to review and make sure that they agree and concur with management's conclusions regarding if there was or was not a material weakness in financial reporting. I think that covers that one.
Okay, and I guess maybe you could comment on the role of the audit committee in relation to internal control, like the role and can the company have material weakness for an inefficient audit committee?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. So I think probably to start on that, I go back to kind of thinking about Sarbanes-Oxley, right? One of the real provisions within Sarbanes-Oxley was it stressed the importance of, I'll say really, in my mind, three parties. there's a role for management, there's a role for the audit committee, and there's a role of the auditor, right? The importance that they play in that, in the process. You know, the audit committee, I think it's really important for them to demonstrate the need for independence from management, understand the entity's business transactions, to be objective in their evaluation of the financial statements, and then exercise oversight of the entity system of internal controls. How I think about that is the audit committee to me is included as part of the entity's control environment, right? And you think about the COSO components around control environment, it really kind of sets the tone for the organization. You think about the tone at the top. So I think in those situations where both management and the audit committee, you know, we would question if they're really objective in their evaluation, they're expressing the appropriate tone at the top. I think there could be a situation where the audit committee as well as management could be determined to be there could be a material weakness related to their roles and responsibilities as well as establishing that tone at the top.
That's very interesting topic because I mean, I guess if there's a discussion between the auditor and management, and it appears that management or the audit committee is not being very objective in terms of their analysis, that by itself could be an indication that they're not making an objective evaluation, and that that could lead to an issue on its own. I guess, and I'm not sure that that's not something that I guess that's discussed that much, but it's very interesting. Very, very interesting concept. I guess another question here is, I guess, what are the SEC views on the importance of internal controls over financial reporting?
Yeah, I mean, I'll take that one as well. Like, I think number one, the SEC, between their guidance as well as you think about enforcement actions that the SEC has issued, they clearly think ICFR is important from that standpoint. The one thing that I would say, becomes a question from time to time is the cost-benefit analysis of 404, the auditor's report around internal controls over financial reporting from that standpoint. And the SEC done cost-benefit analysis of that, right? And in those situations, the SEC in the past has continued to say that the benefits outweigh the cost, and doing it from that standpoint, and we continue on. I think it'll be interesting to continue to see, and given I think everybody knows the political landscape we're in the U.S. right now, I do think there'll continue to be questions around, thinking about what's the threshold for requiring the auditor's report on ICFR. Even today, there've been some I'll say provisions in there, whether it's EGCs that get a 5 years before the auditor reports on ICFR, as well as considerations around that threshold for smaller reporting companies. How to think about that. I think there'll continue to be questions in the U.S. What's the appropriate level for requiring the auditor's report, which is where we spend a lot of our time thinking about the value and the cost benefit of that from that standpoint, because it's another, if you look back at the history of the cost benefit analysis, the cost is really the compliance cost of being a public company. That, having the auditor do that audit of ICFR is considered one of the compliance costs of complying with the rules. So I think it's still up for, from time to time it comes around for debate, but still currently the SEC is still the mindset that the benefits outweigh the cost as far as thinking about internal controls over financial reporting and the requirements for auditors to issue reports on ICFR.
Yeah, I guess I can't resist this. Sorry, Gideon, you're going to comment on that?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think it's a totally the mindset, and there's definitely a lot going on in the U.S. environment. But two things I wanted to highlight here that are very important, just for emphasis, 2 points here is one, definitely tone at the top is very key and along the way of the entire, assessments and cost benefits. I think that's kind of as well, very part of the analysis. It's to really show what a company looks like. But two, I wanted to say that the SEC has still put rules in place to facilitate, get more information and leave a little bit more time to controls being fully like for type. And you may know that there was a change in the definition of a large accelerator filer and a non-accelerator filer, and the threshold in this year. So back to my point early on, it's very important to know in which category you are on at the end of June and to see which costs you need and cost benefit, back to the discussion on cost benefit and what you have to put in place there. But I think the SEC thinks it's strongly still important. However, they're trying to make it sure that it's not an overburden or anything like that will be constraining companies to come to the U.S. market, do transactions, and have a very active transaction market in the U.S. So just wanted to add that.
Yeah, and maybe could you tell us about whether the disclosure of these internal control failures could lead to like a fall in share price at an IPO, and the impact of disclosing it at IPO as versus like identifying it afterwards?
Sure, Kieran. As I said before, it depends, right? However, based on the type of companies and based on what we said so far, it is, in my experience so far, companies and investors almost expect some type of control deficiency because that's not what they are looking at, and they know it's a private company coming to the U.S. and coming to a different environment. And so I think they're looking to invest into a business, if it's a biotech, what development, what stage, what drug, what performance of that is expected of this company. So I think it's more the reverse. It will be impacting the share price and litigation a lot more if there was nothing disclosed into the IPO document, and then you get to your first 20F like a couple of months later, and at that point, because you did further, reporting, everything went well, you don't have your same advisors there, so maybe they caught a few things in there, you didn't think it was really an internal control deficiency, and suddenly you report all this control deficiency. And for whatever reason, the stock price had been down, maybe not because of the control, but, who knows if there might be other things. It's kind of the open door for, issues. So to answer your question, I didn't do an analysis, and I haven't seen, but everything I've read and everything I've seen in practice, the companies have closed IPO and got the share price they wanted, even with material weaknesses being disclosed. So I think it's kind of what we have seen in the market. Would that change? You never know. It really depends, but it depends as well the company and what type of company we're talking about. Of course, if it is a very established company, what could be the impact? But in general, all the analysis I've seen, I've not been pointing that as to be a huge factor impacting the IPO share price, Kieran.
And it's interesting, I guess, one thing was reflecting on these days was the way it's disclosed as well. We had a press report here in Brazil on a company that basically reported on maybe about 10 internal control issues for a local IPO, and then when they were questioned by the reporters, they were explaining that actually none of these were significant deficiencies, and that they just reported everything that the auditor had communicated without classifying them in terms of importance, and I guess that generated a lot of noise in the local market. So I guess the importance of both, explaining what it is and the potential impact of it is important. As that company, at least it generated a lot of noise in the local market, even though they weren't even significant deficiencies or material weaknesses. I guess could you tell? Could there be an impact of unremediated material weaknesses if the company is planning a transaction in the U.S. market?
That's a very good question, Kieran. And we had a lot of debate, and it's one that comes quite often. As we mentioned, there's been a lot of activity in the U.S. market, and therefore, depending on the type of transaction, the auditor may have to do a control letter for the underwriters in the transaction here. So it would have an impact. It could have an impact, I should say, back to Q factor, depending on the material weaknesses we talked about. But let's step back. Why, right? And the idea is to be able to provide negative assurance and saying that nothing changed since the last time, we reported, and that we are not aware of anything, both for management and for the auditor to attest to that. And so refer to the negative assurance. The presumption under a comfort letter is that there's a good control environment, and that's why you can report even after the balance sheet date. If by definition you had a material weakness around financial year-end reporting issues, that you have a hard time to close the books, or that you have issues with the technical skill set and there was transactions. So depending on the type of material weaknesses, definitely it's a big impact on not being able to provide those attestations for a period after the latest balance sheet that is included, the latest interim or annual financial statement that are included. So monthly data could not be possible, for example, because you don't have the right close process on a monthly, right? So if you have a material weakness around your closing process and you are trying to give that the monthly information is accurate, it's going to be difficult. But again, it depends what type of material weaknesses you have, but definitely it could definitely impact the type of level and comfort, which means that if you're doing a transaction, it's something to discuss early on. What type of comfort can I provide or cannot provide? Would that be okay with the parties involved? And usually it is. It's just a matter of explaining it up front, and we may be able to provide different type of comfort, books and records, and it could be totally okay. But yes, it has an impact, and early on, discuss it with the parties involved in the transaction is definitely best versus at the 11th hour when everyone is thinking that everything is going to go like they think about it and that you have to deal with that issue.
Yeah. And I guess once US, what sort of evidence should be maintained to show that the controls work? Experience of people, reviews performed, exceptions identified. If you talk to that.
Yeah, happy to. I mean, I think it's really important to kind of level set from the beginning, because the SEC guidance that I mentioned earlier, was issued back in 2007, makes it clear. It's one of the objectives of the guidance is it says that management is responsible for maintaining evidential matter, including documentation to provide reasonable support for its assessment of ICFR. And it goes on to say this evidence will allow a third party, such as the company's external auditor, to consider the work performed by management. So I think that's really important, that, important for the auditor as part of their audit to have that evidence, but it's also important for management to maintain that evidence, right, as well, to support it from that standpoint. Look, I think the example I used earlier, some controls are easier than others to evidence what actually happened, what actually occurred, right, from that standpoint. The easy, we'll start with the easy one, the reconciliation that's done, and you see where the reconciling items on the reconciliation, there's been investigated, it's been tied out, there's a tick mark or notation made by the reviewer of the reconciliation about their understanding of that reconciling item. That one's kind of probably in the easier bucket. The ones that get more challenging are some of the items that I mentioned earlier, right, around the meetings and these business performance reviews or these review controls and the evidence that needs to be maintained around that. But the same kind of concepts apply here. Is can the auditor kind of understand what was actually performed by the control owner as part of their review process? What did they investigate? Like, what was the follow-up? What was the resolution of those things? And sometimes that takes a combination of discussion as well as obtaining additional documentation, corroborative inquiry with others that were involved in the review of the reconciliation or review of the matter, to kind of understand what was undertaken to review and come to resolution on it from that standpoint. But the key point at the end of the day is management needs it to support their assessment. The auditor needs it to support their audit opinion at the end of the day from that standpoint.
And Wes, does that mean that management should follow the same standards as the external auditor in their evaluation of the internal controls?
Yeah, I think what's really important, alluding back to the 2007 guidance that was issued by the SEC,
The framework for that is the same as the auditing standards. History back 15 plus years ago was the auditors had guidance. The PCAOB had an auditing standard that told the auditors what to do to audit ICFR, but management doesn't really have anything to help us with our evaluation. We don't have any guidance. So many management teams felt like we by de facto have to follow the auditing standards because the SEC hasn't done anything. The SEC, as I said, in 2007 issued management's guidance. And if you look through that guidance, the concepts, and it even says it even in the release that goes along with it, it was really to mirror the requirements and the considerations that the auditor goes through in their evaluation of ICFR for their opinion. So the frameworks are essentially the same, and they mirror each other when you're going through evaluating the definitions of significant deficiencies, material weaknesses. They're pretty much the same from that standpoint. So management and the auditors have I'll call it a common framework for evaluating ICFR as well as deficiencies.
I guess does that mean that then there should be like a sit down at the start and I guess reconcile views with, make sure that auditor and management are aligned in terms of the way they're going to look at things and evaluate issues, and is this something that should be aligned at the start?
Well, I have, over time we've definitely seen the importance of being connected between management and the auditor. Particularly, over time, I think there has been I'll call it the more recurring transactions. There's an understanding of the evidence that's being provided. If there are changes in controls and processes, we often see management teams engage with the auditors and say, hey, we're changing our process of how we're doing this transaction. We're changing kind of how our historical, controls have worked. Let's kind of walk through this together to kind of have some proactive discussion about, well, what are you going to need? Are in your view, are there any gaps, from a design standpoint in our controls? And it's not, I want to be clear, the auditor's not in those situations trying to step in and tell management what their controls need to be. I just think it's proactive discussion, and it's kind of, like anybody, auditors don't want to have any surprises. Management doesn't want to have any surprises. So that proactive upfront discussion, I think, is really, really important. And I kind of layer onto that when you have new transactions. We talked about these non-recurring transactions. We sometimes see that management teams want to have a walkthrough with the auditor kind of even before they go live with the transaction to make sure they understand what the process is and the controls that management's put in place. So it's a little bit of, I'll say, upfront, hey, this is what we're going to do. This is the evidence that we're going to have. Let me understand if there are any issues that, any additional evidence that you may need from an audit standpoint. I just think those expectations up front are really, really helpful to both auditors and management teams as they think about ICFR.
Great. And Wes, are there specific rules for the auditor to ensure that material weaknesses are remediated? And then can you, I guess, explain the principal evidence that would need to be considered in order to determine if a control was remediated?
Yeah, and I think this is another one that it's got to be a management has to make a conclusion. The auditor kind of comes in as well. Do they concur with management's conclusion that it's remediated? But kind of some thoughts on that is, number one, I think anybody, when they're undertaking remedial actions or putting new controls in place, I think it's really important from the beginning to think about, is this remediated control, is it going to address the deficiency that it's intended to correct? And so is there still that risk? There was a risk associated with this that ultimately led us to conclude it's a material weakness from that standpoint. There's an unmitigated risk of material misstatement, right? And so I think in those situations with the remedial action, it's important, what am I putting in place to address that risk? And then the next question I think management needs to ask themselves, is the activity or the control I put in place, is it designed appropriately to address that risk? And so, I start with kind of design and implementation. Design, has it been designed appropriately to address the risk of material misstatement? And then implemented. Is it being implemented? Is it actually taking place? We're not just talking about it, we're actually doing it. and what are we seeing? Does the implementation really support management's viewpoint around the design around that? And so you want to, I'll say that's kind of step one. You want to make sure the control is adequately designed and implemented. That's phase one. And then after after management has determined that it is designed and implemented, then we have to think about, is it operating on a sustained basis? And this is when I'm sure a lot of people get in discussion with their auditors about how many instances of this do we need to see it happen before we can claim it's remediated, right, from that standpoint. And that's, the importance of that is really, it's a sustained process. It's not just, hey, we're just going to do this one time and we think we got it fixed. Lots of times that's not going to work. These are recurring transactions, right, that we have to think about from that standpoint. So I think it's important, and most auditors and management teams come into an agreement based usually on the frequency of the control about how many times we need to see this actually effectively work, like designed, operating effectively, for us to ultimately conclude that a material weakness or control issue is fully remediated from that standpoint. So that's kind of, I would say, the framework, kind of how I typically see management teams and audit committees think through remediation, and that kind of ultimately aligns with kind of how the frameworks between the SEC guidance as well as the PCAOB guidance thinks about control deficiencies.
Great. And I guess, can we expect to see changes in the future in relation to internal control evaluations and how this works?
Well, I mean, I think it's an interesting question. I guess if I could take it from a couple angles. Do I see in the U.S. there being a change by the SEC or the PCAOB with their guidance? I think my view right now is I don't see any of the regulators about to issue any updated guidance, right? If you look at PCAOB and SEC publications during the pandemic, it's really stressed the importance of ICFR and the importance that management maintain appropriate internal controls over financial reporting to reflect the changes in the current environment from that standpoint. I guess the thing I would say, over time, I do think how controls take place, we're moving to more of an automated environment from even where we were 5, 10, 15 years ago. So I think there will continue to be an evolution where you'll see more and more automated controls come in place, more data and technology that's being used as part of controls, right, from that standpoint. And I think management teams, as they use those and continue to strengthen their control environment to whether it's address risk, emerging risk in their business risk or risk of material misstatement in their financial statements, or just continue to strengthen their system of internal controls, I do think you will continue to see people make, changes to how control processes are carried out. And I think that ultimately will result in some changes around how management evaluates their internal controls over financial reporting, but also how the auditor goes about their audit of ICFR. I think that will continue to evolve over time as kind of the controls evolve over time.
And I guess I can't, as if Ghislaine wasn't on the line, you're both sitting there in the U.S., I can't resist to ask the question about, depending on how the election, I guess it's pretty tense at the minute in terms of the presidential elections, but maybe if you could, and it's difficult to predict the outcome still, but maybe if you could tell us about potential changes that could happen at the PCAOB or the SEC in relation to the definition as to who wins the elections.
Ghislaine, you want me to go first, or you want to go first?
You can go, and then I can add my view. Personally, I will put a big disclaimer there. Go ahead, Wes.
Yeah. So here's how I would address that. Hold on. Yeah. So how I think about it, I think clearly if there's a change from a Republican to a Democrat in the White House, I think you'll clearly see a change at the SEC in the leadership. You think about the SEC, 5 commissioners, that includes the chair, right? And you typically have 2 Democrats, 2 Republicans, and the the chair is considered to be an independent, but it usually is aligned to kind of who appointed them at the end of the day. So I think if there is a change in the White House, I think that will naturally happen. And how I think that may play into the PCAOB is the PCAOB, the board members of the PCAOB are appointed by the SEC commissioners, right? If there's a change in leadership at the SEC, I do think, and the history would show, we will likely see a change in leadership at the PCAOB. It usually starts there. They have rolling tenures at the PCAOB, but at any time, frankly, the SEC could come in and say, "Hey, I know you got 2 more years left on your term. We're going to go ahead and we're going to clear it out." This kind of happened. I think you think back to 2017. I think now you had that. You had 5 new board members at the PCAOB appointed by kind of an evolution that you had at the SEC from that standpoint. So I think if there's a change at the White House, I think that would probably be my guess on what might be the impacts at the PCAOB as well as the SEC.
And from my standpoint, as you mentioned, Kieran, it's a very interesting time, obviously, and who knows, we were debating before with Wes a couple of days, couple of weeks before it's completely determined with our president here. One thing we mentioned before, anyway, I think the chair will change as the SEC commission, so it's very unlikely that Jack Layton will continue even if the White House doesn't change. It's a big position. So there could be less changes as a result of just staying in the same party, but you still have the chair of the SEC Commission is usually having a huge impact of the program, of the agenda that they will set up, and obviously as well of what they will do with the PCAOB and the oversight they're exercising with the PCAOB. So in my mind, there would be anyway some changes. Are they going to focus and do a change right away that would go around ICFR and rules? I'm not sure. It always takes time, though, so I just want to, clarify that. They may have different priorities. There's definitely been a lot of discussion you may have seen of where the PCAOB can go access, a lot of discussion about some of the foreign private issuers and like China, foreign private issuers, access to certain markets, inspections. So they are definitely looking at it in a lot of different angles, and I don't think it's going away, but it could definitely get a little different terms depending on who is getting in the White House as well, in my mind. So I'll leave, an update for your end here. Hopefully we will know by then. I will see. Kieran. Yeah. Maybe for our next webcast, I will have a better, we can come and start back with our next webcast to be. So where do we land now? Then see if there was, what we said was like in a little bit in line. We have a little bit over a month. We have a month. We'll see if in a month we can resolve it.
Very good. And I guess just finally, considering the pandemic and where we are currently, if you have any tips for companies considering, their future internal control strategy and how to get the best value, for the investment they have in internal controls, if any comments in that respect?
I would just say one thing from my side is just with the remote environment and then back to the cybersecurity and the process, there's definitely no better time to think about controls right now and then getting to year end and having a strong financial reporting in place. The pandemic and so many people being remote, it's great in a way that we have been able to continue, all of us, providing good information and being relevant here. However, I think we've seen definitely a lot of issues due to the reliance on technology or the issues of having people being separate from one to the other. And so just something to think about. Just, it's a good time now to, prior to year end, look at, is there really no impact or do we have an impact and where is the impact and do we have to put in place 1 or 2 additional controls in place due to this new environment and how was it addressed?
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much. Wes and Ghislaine for your time and all your very valuable comments. And I think with that, I guess we've come to the end of the normal time of the webcast, and now we're going to get into the test required for the Brazilian, for the CRC, for the Brazilian accountants. So thank you very much, Wes and Ghislaine.
You're welcome. Thank you very much. Have a great one.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks. So I guess now we're going to go through the questions for CRC purposes. As from this year, it's a requirement to have that we have questions, and you have to get at least 3 of the 4 questions correct. So the first question is, are companies required to implement internal controls over financial reporting? Yes for all companies, yes for some companies, or no. So I guess companies listed in the US, are they required? Are they all required to implement internal controls over financial reporting? And I guess also to have external audit report on those. And so I guess what is the requirement for reporting? I guess here's the requirement to implement and report on internal controls over financial reporting. So yes for all, yes for some, or no. And then I guess just to remind you that we have a webcast next week talking about startups to IPO and the challenges for startups. So I guess the time's just up on the first question. So like the correct answer is yes for some companies have to implement and report on their internal controls over financial reporting. The majority got that one right. Answer is B. So now we're going to go to the next question. Are companies required to have their internal controls over financial reporting externally tested by an external auditor? So is this no, that they're not required? Yes for certain. And here we're talking about companies listed with the SEC. Is that no, they're not required to have their ICF4 externally tested? No, yes for certain companies, or yes for all companies? Because here, in terms of internal controls over financial reporting, is required for all companies or not. So, and I guess during this time, leave up the and also I guess you see here the slide that we have our next webcast in English on December the 16th. And it's going to be the year-end closing. I guess that the discussion about the preparation for the year-end for the FIs, and what are the issues for this year-end, what are the new SEC rules, what are the new IFRS rules, what are we expecting to see for this year-end, and obviously this year is a special year because of the pandemic. So I guess the time's up on that. The correct answer was B. The majority of people replied B. There are exceptions. It's not all companies are required to have auditor testing in the internal control of the financial reporting environment. And then I guess when should internal control of financial reporting be tested? Is this something that you test at the balance sheet date? At any and here we're talking about external tests. When you contract an auditor to test the internal control of financial reporting, at what date do you do this test? Is it at the balance sheet date, at any date during the latest year, during the last year, or none above? So I guess when do you do the internal control over financial reporting? What's the date that the auditor does his evaluation of the internal control over financial reporting? And then so if you look at the auditor's opinion, what is the reference in the auditor's opinion in terms of the time that the evaluation is done, internal controls over financial reporting? And here, just leading up And here we have the contacts of the presenters today, and feel free to contact them directly and follow up with any questions you may have. I think our time is up here. The correct answer was as of the balance sheet date. So I guess there was differences here between this, but if you look at the date that the auditors report over internal control over financial reporting is as of the date, the balance sheet date, so that's the correct answer. So when should the external audit opinion over internal controls over financial reporting be issued? As at the balance sheet date, at the same time the audit opinion over the financial statements is issued, before the balance sheet date, or none of the above. So when would you normally expect the external audit opinion over internal controls of financial reporting to be issued? As of the balance sheet date, at the same time that the audit opinion on the financial statements is issued, before the balance sheet date, or none of the above. So in this case, when do you expect the issuance of the audit report over internal controls over financial reporting? And there you have the four options. That was the last question. The correct answer was you normally expect to see that the auditor's opinion is normally dated as of the same date as of the date of the audit over the financial statements. Sometimes you see sometimes you see a separate auditor's report on internal controls over financial reporting, or within the same, but normally it's within the same opinion. So the majority of people got that one right. So reply was B. I guess with that now we're going to repeat the questions for people who didn't get 3 of the 4 correct the first time. We're going to repeat. So on question number 1, all companies are required to report on the internal controls over financial reporting. This is true for all companies, true for some companies, or it's not. Companies are not required to do this. I guess just some reminders here. So this webcast is recorded. It's available on the PwC Brazil webcasts page. It should be there, available by Friday. You can contact the emails here of our presenters directly. Please give us some feedback on the webcast. So you also, if you need the access to the slides, we can send those to you as well. And feel free to make suggestions about any topics that you feel you'd like to see webcasts on in the future. And I guess Mark, in your agenda. So next Wednesday, 9 a.m., we're going to talk about the capital markets and from startup to IPO. We're going to have people who work in the startup business talking about how you get a company from a startup through to an IPO phase. And we're going to be discussing a number of companies especially in the healthcare sector, which has really taken off in terms of since the pandemic. I guess that's going to be an area of focus that we're going to be discussing on this webcast. So question number 2, are companies required to have their internal controls over financial reporting externally tested by an external auditor? No, yes for certain companies, yes for all companies. So there you have the 3 options. So if companies are required not to have internal control over financial reporting, no, yes for certain companies, or yes for all companies. I guess we're coming to the end of the time on that one. And as I said, all of these webcasts, they're completely free and open to all those that want to join. So there's no restrictions. And we have people from, I guess in the English ones, we have people from different countries around the world. We have from university students to people doing people working in companies to people in different areas of I guess different areas from I guess in a special hello to all of the retired PwC partners that we have with us. The question number 3, when should ICFR be tested? At the balance sheet date, at any date during the latest year, over the last year, or none of the above. So at which date do you evaluate internal controls over financial reporting? So here we're talking about foreign private issuers, and whenever they issue information in terms of their evaluation of internal controls over financial reporting, is it as of the balance sheet date, as any date during the last year, or over the last year, or none of the above? So at which time do they do their? At which time is it done? So we're coming to the end of this question, and the correct answer, as you could see in the whenever companies report on the internal control over financial reporting, and the auditor reports on that, he reports as of the balance sheet date, which is the date in which it's evaluated. So last question, when should the external audit opinion over internal control over financial reporting be issued? And so when does the auditor issue his opinion? As at the balance sheet date, at the same time as the audit as the issuance of the audit opinion over the financial statements, before the balance sheet date, or none of the above. So when do you expect the auditor to issue his opinion on internal control over financial reporting? As of the balance sheet date, the same date as he issues the audit opinion over the financial statements, or before the balance sheet date, or none of the above. So I guess with that, we're coming to the end of our webcast, and hopefully we'll talk to you all again next week at 9 a.m. whenever we're going to be discussing a number of startups, and especially those in the healthcare service, in terms of what they're doing, how they're growing, and what the main issues are to get from a startup to an IPO. So hopefully we'll talk to you all next week. So I guess with that, we've concluded the webcast for today. Thank you very much for joining us, and with that, we'll end the webcast. So thank you very much, and with that, we end the webcast for today. Thanks again.